Hi, this is Andrea Vicari, and you're listening to Jazz Doodles on jazzlondonradio.com. If you listened to the show 4 weeks ago or so, you might have heard a couple of tracks from Django Bates' new album called Tenacity. Well, today's show is all about Django. I have an interview with him, and you'll be hearing lots of different pieces of music, some of it from Tenacity and some of it from other albums. Just a bit of background knowledge on Django Bates in case you hadn't heard of him before. He's a British composer and pianist and was born in southeast London, and in the late 80s and 90s he made his name with bands such as Human Chain, and you'll hear some music from that later on, and also the eclectic big band called Loose Tubes, and has made a significant contribution to the jazz scene with his many, many albums, and you're going to hear some of those tracks today. And I'm just very happy to have him on my show. So over to Django, and here is the interview after My Little Suede Shoes. Lovely to have you on the show. You recorded an album, Beloved Bird, a few years ago based on Charlie Parker tunes, and now you've just released a big band album called Tenacity. And I wondered what inspired you to write the music and record it?
So I was approached by Norbotten Big Band, and this was a telephone call from the Arctic Circle, so it was quite exciting. And they said, what do you want to do with the band? And since I was working with Beloved at that time, still going in depth into the Charlie Parker arrangements, I just thought, let's just be tenacious and express some tenacity and keep on with this project rather than always jumping to a new thing. So I expanded those arrangements for a big band, and that was an interesting experiment. You know, could it be played, such kind of music that we had to be very close together to play? Could we actually enlarge it in that way? And as usual, you know, from that's why I called the album Tenacity, because this idea of kind of holding on to an idea and not being distracted. And then it's just funny for me how projects have a title which often takes on new meanings. So for Tenacity, keeping going and holding on to what's important in this pandemic came to take a very different and stronger meaning. And then I was reminded that the previous album was called The Study of Touch, and that also takes on a really poignant meaning in this time.
Several years ago, you played in the group Human Chain and Loose Tubes, and the music was fun and drew upon various musical influences such as South African jazz as well as the jazz tradition. How important to your playing and writing was the jazz tradition?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, that, because I had my membership card for Ronnie Scott's club, and if someone like Bill Evans was playing, or the George Adams Quintet, or McCoy Tyner, or any number of real American, you know, the heart of Black American jazz, I'd be down there every night, you know, checking it out, watching it, learning and listening. And yet, when Loose Tubes played there for 2 weeks during that same period, we didn't really play one bar of swing. And it was like an unspoken rule in the band that we weren't going to go there. And I think that was just simply because we felt that much as we loved it, it wasn't going to be the language that we were going to use to express ourselves at that time. And now, as someone who teaches improvisation and composition, I can watch young people and I can see that it's really hard to improvise if you've never heard of Charlie Parker, never heard those phrases and those ornamentations. And if you've never, to be a piano player who's never heard Herbie Hancock, it's going to be like someone speaking English who doesn't know the word and or the, right? It's pretty basic. So jazz is a massive part of my life and my listening. And if I think of somebody who I wouldn't say was really in the tradition of jazz, like let's say Pat Metheny, you listen to one phrase of improvisation for him and you can trace it back to, if you like, Charlie Parker or bebop or that kind of turn of phrase. So I think it's extremely important part of the language of improvisation.
I just brought it up really because as you probably gathered from maybe some of the correspondence, you know, I'm quite familiar with your playing. And when I was an impressionable, I'd say teenager, maybe it was late teens, early 20s, I used to hear, you know, the likes of you play. And what was really interesting, I suppose, was the fact you were playing quite, you know, eclectic music. It wasn't specifically swing jazz, but there was such a strong reference to jazz language, and it was the way you combined it. I mean, I know a lot of people do this, but it's so obvious that you at some point you have absorbed a lot of Charlie Parker, a lot of bebop language, and it's kind of that combination which for me was great. You know, I really love to hear it, and I found it really inspirational. But I think it's an important fact. I mean, I teach as well. I think it's just important for people to bear in mind that jazz tradition. And like you said, it's like learning a language, and you need to learn some of it before you can create your own voice, which is obviously something you have done very successfully. So it's good to hear that from the experts, as we say. And listening to your playing and writing, you can hear the influence of the music of South Africa. And I just wondered if you wanted to talk a bit about that and how that came about.
Yeah. My father had a great record collection. Within each genre, he'd have the most eccentric and interesting part of that genre. And he had he had Zulu choir music on record. He also had a record called In the Townships, and on the front was a picture of Dudu Pakwana in a township. I just assumed this was all going on thousands of miles away. And then I was playing in a club one night, and we were the support. And then, lo and behold, Dudu Pakwana and his band were the main act. So I was in the same room. I was 18 or something. And my God, he's in this country. Oh, he lives here. You know, it's such a revelation. And I was very shy and scared of this very extroverted, loud man who was striding around the stage and, you know, shrieking out instructions and blasting his horn. After his gig, I was desperate to somehow interact with him. So I just went to the piano and very quietly started playing some tunes off that album. And I often tell students about this because, you know, the idea of practicing on your own at home for 5 years, you might think it's a pointless waste of time. And then suddenly you're in a situation where you learnt an album and you're in the same room as the guy whose album it is, and you can play the whole album. And eventually he came over and joined in, and we sat there and we played through the whole album together. And after that, he gave me the gig with the band. And that took me in a van with him and other guys to Europe and got to see a world of music outside of England. So it was enormously important. But I mean, going back to the music, as you say, after every gig, the next day we'd get into this van and he would play the previous night's gig from start to finish, and you'd hear every note that you'd played. And often it was like a 10-minute piece on 2 chords, F for 2 bars, E flat for 2 bars, F. And so you'd be sitting there thinking, I've got to find another way to approach this. Okay, what can I do in between those 2 chords? Or how can I reinterpret the E flat 7 in a different way? So yeah, it was an enormously big part of my musical education. I think being forced to be creative over very limited material, or seemingly limited material, is really helpful.
I mean, I'm very interested in South African music, and I've played, in various bands. I've played with Claude Depper, so I've done some gigs with him, and yeah, you're right. I mean, the harmony is very, minimal, and it's the challenge I find is what you can do with it. But also, there's this vibe that you get of complete joy and energy, which I've found is so important in South African music. I mean, I saw Dudu Pukwan. I don't think you were playing. I think it was Steve Arguelles. It was a dance gig. That was you just feel like the rhythm is there, and you can just like let go and have a lot of fun. And I feel that fun element does come out in a lot of your writing. Do you feel that sense of joy often when you write in that style?
Yeah, I might also say that with the Africans who were actually in England as exiles, they couldn't go home. And I always felt that within their music. Yes, there was this incredible joy and celebration of freedom, but at the same time, there was sadness sometimes and anger. If you think about the free improv stuff that music could fall into so easily. So it was actually quite an emotional mix, I found. And I would say I would describe my music as playing around with emotions in that way.
Was that the inspiration for South Africa, do you think?
Oh, completely. Yes. I mean, it starts as a kind of huge explosion of sound and color, like as someone described it as a sunrise, and I think that's a good description. And then before it goes into this happy, joyous place, it kind of plays around with anthems, because the South African anthem is so beautiful and so jazz harmony rich. And then the English national anthem is kind of played in a very disturbed and cold way and kind of juxtaposed. So, yeah, there's a lot going on in that piece, and it's about the contradictions. Yeah.
You've always played piano and keyboards, and also I should say tenor horn as well. I should have put that in. I noticed on My Little Suede Shoes, that's from your latest album, Tenacity, that you often alter pitch to go slightly out of tune. And I remember hearing similar ideas in the 1980s when you had your own sounds. And this was a time, for example, when the market was full of synths, which had great sounds, but it was really hard to program them without mathematical knowledge, DX7s, D50s. I just add a little bit of personal thing. I couldn't do it at all. I'd have magazines with mathematical formulas that would take me 2 hours, and then you'd end up with a slightly changed brass sound, and it wasn't a question like, I've got a Nord now, it's great, I can just go whack and turn a knob and then suddenly I'm out of tune. So it was a different time, and I just wondered, how did you, obviously you don't have to go into the maths of it, but how did you go about creating those sounds, which I think have become almost your trademark?
Well, I made a lucky mistake. Well, let's say this. First of all, when I first started having gigs, I didn't have any keyboards, and the pianos that would be at those gigs, I mean, the gig with Dudu that I described, that was just a ramshackle old upright. So very soon I thought, I really need a keyboard. And then I made this weird choice of buying a Prophet 5, which is an old analog keyboard by Sequential Circuits. And now they're like collector's items. I didn't realize that. I mean, it wasn't wasn't perfect for everything, but actually playing with Dudu, it had these really cutting Hammond organ sounds. And as you say, you could play with the pitch and you could make your voice stand out with that instrument. It's very hands-on. You could grab a button and it would kind of open an envelope and add a whole new start sound to the note. And then with Bill Bruford, I would take that on planes and we'd go and play in other countries. And often on arrival, it was completely silent for the first 2 days, like as it warmed up back into Earth temperature. So it wasn't very reliable. And then along came the DX7, which is the ultra reliable, as you say, almost unchangeable thing. And I find this hard to believe, but I don't think I could ever do this now. Too many distractions and children and things like that. But to sit down for 2 weeks and mess around with the editing of sounds, that was a real luxury. And if I think about it, with the DX7, I really only did one interesting thing with it, and that's that I stumbled upon the part of the instrument where you can play with a pitch. So a note can just hook upwards slightly and then go below the pitch and then jump back to the proper pitch. So then you get this, well, I call it a warble, like a bird, on the beginning of each note. And as soon as I found that, I applied it to lots of different sounds, and I found that with some of the sounds, it worked really well. I would find often if I'm playing a sound and it's lacking a certain human quality, then I will just bring a bit of that warble effect in with an appropriate sound attached to it. You mentioned weather report. If I wanted to think about keyboards at the time that I was trying to work out how to play them, weather report was a very immediate source to go to. And what I loved about Zawinul's sounds were they were all kind of woody or accordion or like reed instruments. It was very organic, and that's always what I've wanted to get. And so I had a synthesizer within loose tubes, and it could only really work for me if it sounded like one of the band, like another blowing instrument or a reed instrument or something.
I noticed that. I mean, obviously I play as well, but the ones that kind of have more of a legato sound, it's quite a cool way to play. I don't know if that's something you're referring to as well, so that you can provide lots of flourishes and everything without with the sound kind of merging into each other.
Yes, and the beginning of the note is really important. If something starts with a really hard metallic beginning, it's very hard to play. So you've got to play around with how you want the notes to fall into the silence, fall into the air. And then after a while of playing around with keyboards, you realize even more how incredible a real piano is, because it can never be replicated by any magical scientific knowledge. Well, not so far.
No. Yeah. I think we get quite technical here.
Yeah.
That's the trouble when you get a piano player.
Exactly.
They're interviewing another one. So I'm going to move off that subject just for a minute. You teach at the Bern Conservatoire. It's called HKB.
That means Hochschule der Kunst, and that's the University of the Arts.
Okay, I was going to ask you what that meant. And before that, you were at the Rhythmic Music Conservatory in Denmark. In the UK, much of the teaching of jazz follows the American tradition of learning through the jazz standard repertoire. I'm based at Trinity Laban, and I'm partly in that process of teaching that. In your experience, do these European schools have a different approach? And I just wondered if you kind of inferred what you taught already, but if you want to just remind us what you teach at the Bern Conservatoire.
Yeah, I'm lucky in that I get to teach composition, piano students, improvisation. I fit that in wherever I can, discussions about improvising over different forms and things. And I also run a big band here now. So here, the curriculum is largely decided by the teacher. So what happens is a student comes, I look for anything that can inspire and guide that person based on what I'm hearing them already playing on their instrument and what's interesting to them. Fill in some gaps, also really push their composing, so they have to do some hard work and not do the first thing that comes to mind. And you mentioned jazz standards because there are some schools which are very much based on that language. I would say if someone comes to my lesson and says, look, I'm in this ensemble and we're playing this tune and I'm finding it really hard to be myself over this material, or I can't get around this corner here in a way that satisfies me, then that's really fun to look at that, because then you're going specifically into the detail of a piece and the challenge. Then you can just say, let's look at the melody. What are the intervals here? What's the kind of language of this melody? And have some fun interpreting it with them. So it's not a major part, it's just a part of the many possibilities that we can play around with.
So there's no kind of central kind of curriculum from your university that says in year 1 and 2 they've got to do certain things, or are you just not having to follow that curriculum as a composition teacher? Because
it's a university of the arts, there's a lot of accent on being contemporary and working with other art forms and finding your own language. But yes, they go to harmony classes where they go into detail with a certain composer, be it Steve Coleman or whoever, Tim Byrne, Kenny Wheeler, whatever it is. There is a structure there. Yes, I suppose I tend to get the students later on when they're quite clear about their direction, and then it's a case of just being part of that journey with them.
It's always interesting, to know what goes on overseas, because it's, I suppose the UK is quite, in some ways it's quite closed, in other ways it's probably quite open. But I've worked in, conservatoire for a number of years, and I really haven't got a clear idea apart, what goes on around the world, except I meet up with people and chat with them. But I think it's always good to hear it from someone who's actually working there. I'm just going to get on to my last question. But before I do that, I'm scared to death I'm going to forget to say this. So I'm going to say happy birthday, Django. It was your birthday the weekend. It was a significant birthday. I hope you enjoyed yourself, and happy birthday.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I had a great time. Thank you.
I think I saw a picture of you eating cake or something on Facebook or something. So it's good to know.
Eating very colourful mushrooms was my choice.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Final question today, and I just wondered how the coronavirus, which is obviously so prevalent at the moment, has affected you personally in terms of your career, and is the situation in Switzerland and maybe Europe similar to the UK? So you may be aware that pretty well everything's stopped, and venues I think in the long term are going to struggle to survive financially. So I just wondered how it had affected you.
Yes, my last gig was in mid-March, and the whole of the next 12 months of gigs that I had planned have disappeared. Oh, there's one left at the moment. I'm just hoping that will happen. And that would be in Frankfurt later this month, actually playing the Tenacity material with Hessische Rundfunk big band. So actually it's a huge prospect if it happens. But 12 months of gigs gone. And it wasn't that I had loads of gigs, and it's not as if I live purely from gigs. It was more that in my 60th year, I had this plan just to kind of revisit lots of important things. So I had a gig with Ian Bellamy, for example. We haven't played together for years and years and years. At the Wigmore Hall, that's gone, of course. And then Josephine Lindstrand, just important people to me that I wanted to play with during this year. And it's very weird, of course, like it is for everybody. Very weird to think that that's all disappeared. I'd say for much of my life, I've been a musician who's also had another job. And I think that came from being brought up with the idea that art is not a career, it's a way of life. And I interpreted that as meaning I better have another source of income. And in the beginning, that was washing up or collecting newspapers and selling them to a recycling company, whatever. And later in life, it's been perhaps more rewardingly teaching. But yeah, so when the lockdown started in mid-March, a lot of times I go away at weekends and I do gigs, or during the week I'm teaching. So there was a bit of a language problem between me and my Bernese family. The kids, they don't particularly like English, or it's not their kind of instinct to speak English. And it was amazing to see within about 2 weeks of lockdown how the language barrier disappeared and broke down, and the family became more of a unit through that process. So
did they start speaking English to you then?
Oh yeah, much better English. Yeah, I mean, you could say, why didn't it work the other way around? Why didn't I learn Bernese? But anyway, my brain is older and not so good at learning. I guess that's the simple answer. But just to say, yeah, so it's been a mixed experience for me, the whole pandemic. In some ways, extremely rewarding. Just before it happened, I'd given up flying. I bought a train ticket that was going to last 3 months, completely free train travel in Europe, which I never got to use. But then suddenly there comes a pandemic and there's much less flying going on. And it's almost like there's a part of this picture which is very gloomy and depressing, and there's another part which has a kind of feeling of inevitability about it. We did have to stop flying, and now we've stopped. So it's hard to make sense of it because we're right in the middle of it. But of course, I'm extremely worried for so many friends in England, particularly. In Switzerland, there are a few big gigs happening, but for me, Switzerland is a base in the middle of Europe. I normally go out and play in other places, and at the moment that isn't possible. That's not happening.
Are any venues, is there anything happening in Switzerland or in the nearby? I just get, someone said, oh, I've got friends in Germany and they still seem to be doing gigs. And I wonder if people are just pretending and
posting
they've done this and that, when really there's hardly any audience. There's that feeling of like, oh, look at me, I've actually got something, but it would be nice to think that some of these countries have managed to keep some live music going. So I just wondered if you had an experience of that, knowing about.
Yeah, there definitely is some live music happening in clubs. I saw Julian Siegel going into the Unterfahrt in Munich, and the Moods in Zurich is putting on performances, reduced audiences, and even some musicians wearing masks, and so it's all quite otherworldly, but it is happening. Yes, it's happening much more in, at least I can say, in Germany and Switzerland that I know about. Yeah. In a couple of weeks' time, I'll know whether we actually get to Frankfurt and do this big gig where the whole big band will be 1.5 meters apart, each musician. You can imagine the time lag challenges. Now, since you've heard the album, you can imagine trying to play that music with a distance of, I don't know, 20 meters between the flute and the trumpet.
I'm imagining it now. It's already some of the times a bit stretched, so it's just gonna, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Crazy. I mean, I suppose, I suppose you just have to be optimistic, because if you're not, your whole outlook's going to be very depressing. And there does come a point, I think, where you've just got to think, we'll get through this at some point. And yes, there might be a hit, and yes, some things might not happen, but let's just be positive about this. I don't know if that's something you feel about the situation.
Well, as I've described, I can look at part of it and see something very positive, and of course it makes sense to focus on that, because what's more important than family? Is my crazy time-stretched arrangement of Donna Lee being performed in Frankfurt more important? Probably not. Nearly as important, not quite.
Well, that's a great thing to think about. I'm going to finish this interview now, and you've been a great interviewee, Django Bates. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on your writing and the jazz scene in Switzerland, and good luck in your future.
It's great to be virtually in London for a change.
You've been listening to Andrea Vicari, Jazz Doodles, jazzlondonradio.com.